Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
The fact is that the education mission is secondary to the teachers union. What they're really concerned about are their members and preserving, their benefits, whatever, advocating for teachers. Now, I don't know if the Uvalde police are unionized or not. I don't think it really matters, but this sense that municipal employees, what they're all about is like the job and their pensions, protection, whatever. So I don't know if it's the bureaucratization of it or just the professionalization in a sense, not professional in the sense of like accreditation, but just here's your job. This is your job, like the jobization of the job. Like this is what you do, and keeping it together, keeping it's almost like the thin blue line, but in a negative sense. Look, I'm pro-cop. I write about this all the time. I'm not going to take a backseat to anyone on this question, but I think if you're going to be honest and be like pro-law and order and pro-police and pro-law enforcement, you have to accept that sometimes there are really bad cops and there are really bad departments, and sometimes they just really screw up badly, and maybe they need to rethink certain aspects of how this job is done.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind, and glad as always to be joined by managing editor Seth Barron and publisher and president Ryan Williams. We've got a full slate today, as often, and we wanted to begin with Equitypalooza. We're going to have equity today, equity tomorrow, equity forever, it seems, out of this administration. Seth reminded me on Slack today that was, in fact, the pledge that Biden made to put equity at the center of all that his administration does. And we wanted to sort of dip in and check out some of the the delivery on that promise. Equity, of course, whatever positive meaning it may once have had, now thoroughly perverted to mean the perverse and sort of inverted idea of equality of outcomes, and even perhaps more perversely of choosing certain favored classes and elevating them at the expense of others. The traditional American ideal, the true, the good American ideal of equality before God and therefore before the law, totally in the rearview mirror. When you hear people talking about equity, they are talking, well, actually, let's hear in their own words what they're talking about, because we've got a range of things to review here. The first is this executive order from Biden's White House. Didn't get a lot of press that I saw, but I guess this was back in 2021. He had advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government, including at OMB, the Office of the Management of the Budget, shall, in coordination with the heads of agencies, study strategies consistent with applicable law for allocating federal resources in a manner that increases investment in underserved communities, as well as individuals from those communities. The director of OMB shall report the findings of this study to the president. Now, that's from 2021. More recently, we've got the Biden White House announcing its support for a House bill that would add, I'm reading here from the Wall Street Journal, that would add racial equity to the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and full employment. WSJ opinion going on. Recall that candidate Biden advocated making reducing racial disparities a third monetary mandate, along with the Fed's dual mandate of price stability and full employment. This is really a striking announcement from the Biden White House, even in the context of having signaled its interest in equity at all times and in all places. The idea that that money policy is itself going to be racially slanted, according to the Democrat Party's favored groups at the moment. Now, of course, it perhaps always bears repeating when we talk about this stuff that nobody at Claremont is opposed to actual American equality of the kind that we mentioned, but it's become increasingly clear that in this Democratic Party, equity means handouts, and equity, in fact, means reparations. It's all kind of a piece with this even crazier initiative. This is out in California, where they have established a reparations task force. I'm reading here from the website of Rob Bonta, the Attorney General in the state of California, DOJ. Ryan informs me that among the topics discussed here at the Reparations Task Force are shade equity. Not shade as in throwing shade, not shade as in shade that lid, for those of you that have listened to Let's Have a Kiki, but in fact shade in terms of people not having enough trees around them to give shade to certain neighborhoods that have been, shall we say, historically disadvantaged. That's some of the more frivolous and absurd dimensions of this. But of course, this goes, as we saw, it goes not only up to the Fed, but also into every dimension of American life, the construction of racial castes and favored classes, which flies directly in the face, of course, of actual American equality before the law. One last pair of news stories that I'll throw in before I hand it over to the group is that we refrained from mentioning when it happened the recall of Chesa Boudin, I guess is how you say that. You can correct me, Ryan, if I'm wrong. But San Francisco's DA was recalled. This is another, radical sort of racialist in his policies and in his approach to law enforcement. The idea that it's inequitable to put criminals in jail because both victims and perpetrators of crime are often in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods and neighborhoods with a non-white racial population, shall we say. So this is, again, not to accuse any one race of committing more crime in some sort of inherent sense, but simply to note that this is the kind of thing that the philosophy of equity pans out in, that if you are measuring things by their outcomes, then you're going to end up advocating the complete dismantlement of law and order just to get the numbers right and to tinker with them. There's another recall coming up of a similar figure in Los Angeles. DA George Gascon, a petition to recall him at recalldageorgegascon.com. We will watch that with interest, but let me ask you guys this. We have this, full court press from the administration and from Democrats in Congress to make equity the governing principle of all elite American life, and indeed American life, especially in densely packed urban centers. And then we also have this relatively surprising sort of rebuff to that idea from the voters, even in San Francisco and potentially in other parts of California as well. Do you guys think that we are heading on a collision course here between elites and the public? Do you think that it doesn't matter because the elites have such an ironclad grip on the government? What's your read on that?
Elites and the public, I'm not sure. It depends on the elites. If you look at some of the stats about, at least up north, we'll see what happens in LA. But it's not the typical NIMBY white liberals who are recalling the likes of Boudin. I don't know if it's Boudin or Boudin. Spencer?
Poutine.
Poutine.
It's
poutine.
Right.
It's like the French fry dish. Okay.
Yeah, but it's like poutine, but boudin. But it's spelled like the Louisiana delicacy boudin, which is a sausage stuffed with rice and other goodies. Anyway, Chesa Boudin. It was predominantly kind of ethnic communities of especially Asians who are voting in mass, or to a large degree, to try to kick out the anti-law and order DA candidates. We should add that most of whom are funded by George Soros. So he spent $40 million, I think, in recent years to try to elect these types of anti-crime enforcement DAs, or a remarkable development. So we'll see how it shakes out in LA. But I think it's the kind of upper middle class, less favored ethnic proles, if I can mix all those things, who are revolting against this social experiment, which has been pushed by upper middle class and above white liberals. And of course, in a lot of these places, the people disproportionately hurt are the law-abiding members of minority communities who have to deal with rampant crime, which is the logical result of not enforcing the law in all manner of misdemeanors. I just you alluded to it, Spencer, but I just want to put a point on this for a lot of our listeners and how to think about this, because it really is, in a way, shadow reparations. That's how we need to think about equity. It's given the tenor of racialized ideological politics on the modern left, this really is all about the descendants of slaves and really blacks in America, and more generally, everyone else is kind of a sideshow. Now, for historical reasons in America, it's understandable why our sort of civil rights movement has evolved to this point from the 60s on. But in any event, because of just because of how demographics break down and how crime shakes out and how disparities in education and all this sort of thing breaks down demographically, a push for equity to redress outcomes that are different amongst the groups will disproportionately favor blacks in America. And so I think either consciously for some and then subconsciously or just as a matter of course for others, the push for equity is a push for a kind of shadow reparations. Spencer mentioned that document out of the Reparations committee or whatever it is in California with its recommendations. But yeah, there's more trees and more shade in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. We have to redress that. I mean, it's really comprehensive. They call for free healthcare for blacks and others. Reduced, or basically a 2-track or multi-track system of punishment at schools because they disciplinary procedures disproportionately hurt blacks. I mean, it's sort of across the board: crime, education, access to services, and all the rest. And the premise behind all of it is the premise that we've talked about before, which is really, the main scholar on all this is Ibram Kendi. Any different outcome is really proof of racist policy. So until you get all the outcomes the same across everything, that is, until you get equity, quote unquote, you have a problem. And so to the extent that we embrace, and we do, the old sort of Federalist Papers notion of Madison's that the unequal faculties of men will produce unequal amounts of property and all the rest. If that's a part of human nature, then really the only way to get equity, as understood by the modern left, is through a quasi soft at first and then increasingly hard kind of totalitarianism. That is, to control all aspects of life, to redistribute, and to favor one group over the other through bureaucracy and under the guise of, quote unquote, scientific anti-racism.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's an interesting question about what you brought up there is, well, which comes first, equity or which comes last, rather, equity or reparations? I mean, the way the Democrat Party is structured now, 25% of the Democrat vote is basically black. So that's their base. And that's who they have to appeal to. And then liberal whites feel this kind of, sentimental or whatever. The appeal grabs them too. So what I think is going on, I mean, because if you look at the reparations document, it doesn't say like we should give free health insurance just to black people. It says we should have free health insurance.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah.
So what I think is going on is the left has come up with reparations as this wedge, and they're just going to keep hammering on this. And I mean, if you look at, not in this particular document, but there's another one where they talk about basically all the different ways in which Black Americans have been had all of their property and wealth stolen, dating back to 1619. And they operate on this assumption that if all of the money they had been like wisely invested, all the money that they should have been paid had been, optimally invested, well, we're talking about trillions of dollars of accumulated wealth. But then it's not just the money that they lost in wages, but, they have to be compensated for years of life that were lost due to stress, due to racism, or, having to travel farther to get places, whatever. So, ultimately, we're talking about probably like, I think the estimates are like, $40 trillion. Now, this is well beyond the ability of America to come up with it. So I suspect, and I think the left and like the people who are pushing this, at least like the white elites who are pushing this, know full well that we're never going to start cutting like $20 million checks to every black person. So I think what they like to say is, well, guess what? We've come up with a workaround. We're just going to institute full socialism, and that'll capture everybody. So the great irony of reparations is what it'll wind up doing is basically making everybody like 20% poorer and putting the left in permanent control of all of the institutions, which is really the point. And I mean, look, we all know any reparations that are paid out will never be. It's not like there's going to be like, okay, here's the final reckoning, and it's all being paid out now, and shake hands, and we're done. No. This is just a down payment. I mean, everybody knows that, right? Because what about a black person who's born tomorrow? Where's their $20 million? So this is just going to, I mean, we all know that this is not going, none of this is going to, cash payments, tree planting, low income mortgages, which they've been doing for, 50 or 60 years to no avail. None of this is going to satisfy anybody or fix anything. I do think that like full socialism is the plan here.
And it goes so much deeper than like actual economics in terms of dollars and cents, right? I mean, for a while now, they've been expanding the concept of racism and the concept of whatever historic inequality beyond all recognition. You've got Pete Buttigieg out here talking about like bridge racism or whatever, because some aides like summarized a couple paragraphs from the power broker, right? And like they did it with COVID vaccines, right? We're going to prioritize racial equity. I'm looking at Duke's health policy page right now, prioritizing equity in COVID-19 vaccinations. Who gets this drug, right? So, I mean, there is one hesitates to say a religious, but certainly a totalizing character to this idea that there's just actually a certain set of favored classes whose every experience of who must come first in every part of life, right? Which just is reverse racism, right? That thing that you're not supposed to believe in. And it's kind of interesting to me that we have this coming down the pike at the same time as the Supreme Court is making this big decision on affirmative action, right? You have basically Asian students versus Harvard. That's not the actual name of the case, but that's what's going on, that Harvard, tamps down on Asian students' applications because otherwise there would be too many Asian kids in their class, and they want to even out the racial proportions in a way that's more favorable to black people, basically, but to Latinos and so forth. And so, I think when we talk about this equity stuff of that famous Sandra Day O'Connor quote, the affirmative action thing, that'll just be for a sort of stopgap measure just to kind of get us back to square one, right? Just to get us back to center. And Seth, you're absolutely right.
Maybe just for 25 years. And that was
20, but yeah.
Yeah,
that
right.
Was that was June of 2003. Yeah.
Right. And so, that you're absolutely right, Seth, that has proven, that limiting principle has proven completely bunk. And anybody that believed in it was either, a useful idiot or had some sinister ulterior motive. And so, it's kind of interesting that we're now, the court itself is sort of poised to potentially repudiate that logic. But as a operating system for total restructuring of American society, it's basically taken over the party in the administration.
Yeah, on the kind of socialism to totalitarianism side, just recall we discussed it at least a year ago or whenever it was. Kendi's answer in the Politico survey of, what would you do to fix racism in America? And he'd have a Department of Anti-Racism, which would rely on experts, which would set its own budget, be uncontrollable by the political branches. So sort of modern progressive dream, and would investigate any and all policies down to the local level that produced unequal outcomes, and in a way would have to pre-clear all policy in America ultimately. Yeah, this Department of Anti-Racism. So I think that's, the open question is how many of these scholars and activists actually believe that is the solution, and how many just use it, as you kind of indicated, Seth, as just a cudgel and talking points and a politically useful, weapon.
Yeah.
How many of them are just cynical about it and opportunistic, and how many are really true believers? I think Kendi seems to me to be a true believer, but
yeah, maybe it's hard to figure him out.
Yeah,
but the big question is, electorally, we all know the phrase "the coalition of the fringes."
Yeah,
okay. Black Americans sort of see themselves as the senior partners in this coalition. But it's not clear that the other members of the Democrats are so hot to sign on to this program. Is there any compelling argument to be made to Cuban, Venezuelan, or Mexican Americans why their interests and priorities must take a back seat? Asian Americans, similarly, as we saw in I don't know if anybody saw this. There's this classic picture of Chesa Boudin standing on a corner, handing out palm cards to people, begging to keep his job, and he just has this glum look on his face, and there's this Chinese American woman walking by just kind of ignoring him, and he's sort of looking at her. It's so memeable, it's amazing. Who exactly? Okay, yes, there is a constituency of minorities who, and generally poor people who rely on either their municipal workers, or they rely on the blue state model to provide them with health insurance and relatively generous SNAP benefits, things like that. But all told, I don't see why we should assume that Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Asian Americans see their interests as in alignment with this reparations regime, or how are you going to compel them to see the justice in taking a back seat to their own interests? How does this factor for them? And what does that mean for the Democrats electorally?
Yeah, that is sort of the tension that I think these various stories illustrate. And we've run a number of pieces in CRB. Bill Vogley has done some good stuff, I think, on this, that, this coalition, famous coalition of the ascendant, which is supposed to consist of every non-white American that will flock to the left, is, this poses a serious challenge to that, among other things, among other reasons why every person who's not white might not be flocking to Biden's doorstep, like the economy, for instance. But yeah, this thing where there are, whatever the flavor of the month is, and it's usually to do with, America's history of slavery. That's usually what the drum they keep banging. But it's not the only drum. There's also the trans drum, which is totally unappealing to to many, I think, people, racial minorities, and rightly so, as it should be to like anybody with their head on straight. And it puts them in a bit of a bind. I mean, I hate to be the optimist. Our friend Inez Felcher got down on me on Twitter today for being such an optimist. But I do feel like, you know, there are real problems with this procedure, even if there's the potential to do a ton of damage along the way. And, you know, the whole thing is loathsome, and any amount of success they're able to have with it is despicable. But also, the Chesa Boudin thing is really telling. It's like, you know, please won't somebody get on board with my race baiting and handouts. It's like maybe not so much.
You know, I'm sorry. I just wanted to point out another thing, which is if you look at the roster of the people who form this reparations commission, I mean, normally you would think, oh, okay, well, this has got to be a very diverse group.
Yeah.
But it looks like there's 9 people. 8 of them are Black, and 1 of them is like Japanese American. Which just seems like strange optics. I mean, so it's basically a non-diverse group. You know, strictly speaking, there's like no Latinos, there's no whites. I mean, you'd think they'd want to present this reparations not as a platform of demands or a bill, like an invoice. Here's what you owe us. But as, I mean, they at least want to present it as like a collaboration, like a, you know, here's what we've decided justice would look like. But they have no buy-in. I mean, I guess they assume, well, you'll just buy in because you will.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be like we want institutions and TV shows and schools and clubs that quote unquote look like America, which the implication of which was that there were going to be like the exact same proportional percentage of people on each committee as there were, you know, in the whole country. And leaving aside the fact that that's like an obviously impossible goal for a number of reasons, including that, you know, which measurements do you take of which particular percentage and so forth. But like, even leaving that aside, they have kind of abandoned that. And I mean, to me, what this suggests is that, you know, not to get racialist myself for a second, but it's like, it's a purely white neurosis, this thing. You know, it's basically white liberals, as always, you know, working out their own kind of fever dream of you know, guilt and recrimination, and doing so with whatever form of tokenism they can muster, you know, while grabbing as much power as they possibly can. Because of course, like, you know, there was that famous Stephen Colbert thing where somebody said, you know, he was coming on talking about reparations. He was like, well, you can't have my job. You know, I mean, that's sort of, to me, it's pretty patently obvious that kind of, you know, affluent white liberal spirit is motivating the whole thing, or at least is an important component of it. And speaking of the fever dreams of affluent white liberals and leftists, we should talk about the Supreme Court decision that just came down the pike. Not the big one that we're sort of expecting, which is Dobbs, that's been leaked but not yet released in final draft, but rather Carson versus Macon, I guess is how you say that. This is a decision that came out of Maine, where there is a rule. Let me see if I can get this right. The Maine Department of Education has a rule where if you are in a school district that neither operates a secondary school of its own nor contracts with a particular school in another district, then you can basically get a chunk of money to send your kid to a school of your choice if it qualifies. And it turns out that the only requirement is that the school qualify as, quote, non-sectarian, which meant that like Christian and parochial schools were not getting this money, which meant that parents in these, you know, sort of remote regions couldn't send their kids to those schools and get the money that the state otherwise would promise them. This was challenged. It went up to the Supreme Court, and the court has just decided, handed down this decision that, in fact, it's unconstitutional to discriminate against parochial schools in this way. And you know, we've been in touch with some of our legal scholar friends to write about this, so we probably will post some things on the site coming down the pike. But to me, the really interesting thing for us to talk about is, you know, and this is one of the things that some folks who are writing for us have been pointing out, is that, you know, this sort of should have been an open shut case looking at it. It seems to me as if this is an obvious case. I mean, you don't even have to get into the kind of real based takes about, well, like, you know, what even counts as a religion to be protected under the Establishment Clause, and is separation of church and state really a thing, or is that just something that, you know, Jefferson wrote in a letter one time, and have we lost the plot basically since 1947? All of that stuff seems germane, but also this case seems like it should have been open and shut. I mean, the thing about it that really aggravates the left, at least, it seems to be this idea that we're basically, the court is tearing down. Sotomayor in her dissent said the court is tearing down the wall of separation between church and state. And even though this is just these sort of remote counties in Maine, it seems like this would apply, as far as I can tell, to anywhere where school choice in some form or another is an issue, right? If the state is deciding that rather than funding schools is going to, quote, fund students, that is, give money to parents to send their kids to places, then this decision would suggest, and I think rightly, that you can't forbid those parents from sending their kids to religious schools. And the stark contrast reading these decisions between the court's majority opinion and Sotomayor's very short dissent, in which it basically comes across that for this so-called constitutional wall of separation between church and state, for this to ever hold good, we must insist that, you know, all state money go only toward not only, you know, not to make distinctions between different sects or different forms of religion, but that we can only fund things that are expressly secularist, or as Mike O'Metacroft said on Twitter, expressly godless. That seems to me to be a real, I mean, that does seem to be the split that's emerging within the court. Thankfully, on the kind of pro-actual religious liberty side currently is where the majority is. But here's Sotomayor. What a difference 5 years makes. In 2017, I feared that the court was leading us to a place where separation of church and state is a constitutional slogan, not a constitutional commitment. Somebody might note to her here that, in fact, separation of church and state is a slogan and not a constitutional commitment. Anyway, today, the court leads us to a place where separation of church and state becomes a constitutional violation. If a state cannot offer subsidies to its citizens without being required to fund religious exercise, any state that values its historic anti-establishment interests more than this court does will have to curtail the support it offers to its citizens. With growing concern for where this court will lead us next, I respectfully dissent. I saw this on Twitter sort of unfolded into this truly, to me, Baroque fever dream that now the next step is going to be outlawing any religion except for Christianity. And that what has to happen now to really show those conservatives is all these Muslim schools and Jewish schools should open up, and then they'll be eligible for funding too. And of course, in fact, there was a junket of, I think, Muslim schools and maybe also Jewish schools that filed an amicus brief in this case. So to me, the interesting thing here is the distinction between a court which seems to want to get at the true meaning of the Establishment Clause, and a left which basically thinks that, like, we're headed for, you know, a theocratic takeover of the country. Am I being unfair here? Is there anything more to this Sotomayor idea than just, like, you know, Handmaid's Tale, but this time with parochial schools?
Well, the left always looks at things in this whom perspective. So they assume that the right is doing the same thing. Like with guns, you know, Whoopi Goldberg is like, or Joy Behar is like, once black people start getting guns, then the Supreme Court will outlaw guns. It's like, well, you know, black people get guns. Like, what are you talking about? That's like the Second Amendment people are not in favor of, you know, guns because they want to keep blacks from getting guns. Similarly with abortion, they're like, well, okay, fine. You want to restrict abortion? Well, we're going to demand that men have to pay child support. It's like, fine, that's fine. That's okay. Similarly with this, no, they're not trying to outlaw Jewish schools or Muslim schools. You know, I guess I would like to understand more about what the implications of this ruling are. Like, you know, for places that aren't in central rural Maine, where there are there are there are public schools available. Like in New York City, does this now mean that you can get funding to send your kid to a parochial school?
I sort of think, and hashtag I am not a lawyer, but it sort of seems like the main issue at stake here is kind of school choice, right? If there's any sort of setup where the state is giving you money rather than just having public schools, the state is giving you money to send your kid to a school of your choosing, that now that has to include religious schools. And again, in my view, quite rightly, I mean, there is this interesting schizophrenia that I've been noticing. And I'm sure that other legal scholars and people who are legal scholars at all would be better able to put this into words. But on the one hand, when secularists, want to use the court to forbid sort of any state investment in anything that whiffs of religion, at that point, they're perfectly happy to say what is and isn't a religion, right? This parochial school, that's religious, but this school where they teach that men can be women, that's not a religion. That's just pure secularism. But then on the other hand, when it's a question of which secular groups can receive the protection of the Establishment Clause, they feign this just like total ignorance or agnosticism about what counts as a religion. Well, the atheist society or the flying spaghetti monster, who's to say that shouldn't have the same protection as the Catholic Church or, a mosque or whatever. And that really does seem to me like a double standard. Like it seems like either the word religion means something and certain forms of organization get the protection that the Establishment Clause guarantees, or the word religion can just be like anything that people really feel a strong conviction and belief about. In which case, like, who's really to say that funding like public schools in New York City isn't funding a religious institution after a certain fashion? I mean, they're certainly teaching articles of faith there that are just as abstruse and invented as anything that the Catholic Church ever came up with. I don't know. That just seems really like fundamentally illogical to me and deep rooted in the core.
It's of a piece of our confused First Amendment religious jurisprudence over more than a century. I mean, implicit in Sotomayor's and her confusion between slogan and doctrine or principle, this has been brewing since at least the 30s, if not before, 1930s, that is. We're very confused about what the Establishment Clause or the First Amendment in general means these days. It seems to be, modern secular liberalism, which is to say modern liberalism, thinks that the separation of church and state, which is a slogan that appears nowhere in the Constitution, requires government to be basically on the side of irreligion or the absence of religion over religiosity. But the First Amendment reads as following. We should just remind ourselves from time to time. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the religion. Those are the religion clauses that open the First Amendment. This is a free exercise case, I believe. I haven't read the opinion yet. Our colleague Phil Munoz, who's teaching at the Publius Fellowship right now, well, he will be as of tomorrow. He gets into town tomorrow. We'll be teaching the day after on this stuff and other stuff like it. Phil's argument is that really the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, more than anything, sought to remove from governmental jurisdiction questions of religious sectarianism. That's the main thrust or the point of them. I want to read from one other thing, and our deep diehard Claremont folks will roll their eyes at this because they've heard it many times. But Article 3 of the Northwest Ordinance from 1787. So this was Congress passed this to govern the territories, starting in the Ohio River Valley and like stretching beyond it. So a large portion of what is now the Midwest and parts of the Great Plains. Article 3 said the following: religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So the implication of that is that the founders certainly had no problem whatsoever linking intimately school, religion, especially Christianity, and self-government. And so we've come a long way from that. I think that's the common sense understanding of at least still a plurality of Americans, which is that, no, I mean, small r Republican citizenship rests on decent morals, which for most people in most, Western civilized countries over millennia has been rooted in some sort of basic monotheism, with Christianity dominant and with toleration for the two other great traditions, so long as they aren't contrary to the public good or involved in law breaking. That's what we have to get back to. And so, of course, government is not establishing a religion by doling out money and being neutral about where parents spend that money on the education of their children. We just have to get back to that common sense understanding. And unfortunately, to do that, you kind of have to scrape off more than a century worth of pretty confused jurisprudence on this question, driven by modern liberalism, which is really of the view that, around every corner, if you aren't vigilant every day at the local level, all the way on up to the Supreme Court, there's some theocrat lurking, ready to impose, the Handmaid's Tale. And I think that's just alien to the common sense of most Americans who live outside the big cities and are unencumbered by, terminal masters and graduate degrees.
Yeah.
What did you think? Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, what did you think of the somewhat novel argument adduced by this progressive rabbi in Florida, who claims that because the Jewish religion, in some interpretations, permits abortion under certain circumstances, that it's a violation of the free practice of religion not to allow people to get abortions?
Well,
yeah, that's pretty nifty, but ultimately fails.
Too clever by half. I mean, you can. This was another thing that the founders were pretty clear about. You can outlaw most anything if you're not outlawing it because it's a religious practice. I mean, if they were saying like abortion is illegal precisely because the Jewish tradition in some interpretations sometimes allows it, that would be a severely unconstitutional thing to do. But if you're saying like, you can't murder people, you can't shoot adults, in the street, and then somebody says, well, my religion says, shoot thou thine adult in thine street. Like that seems like it doesn't quite work.
Yeah. I mean, the principle that sits under or is the foundation of the free exercise clause is, of course, at a certain level, the equality principle. That is, we're all created equal. None of us are beasts nor gods. We don't have the right to rule each other without our consent. And that means we don't have the right, especially, to kill each other without consequence and indiscriminately. So then you're just thrown back on the foundational question for pro-choice versus pro-life, which is, when does a human being start? I maybe have raised it before on this show, but I like Peggy Noonan, who can be kind of windy and less than interesting these days in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. About 10 years ago or so, had a good line about capturing sort of Aristotelian teleology in a common sense sort of way. And she said, at a certain point, this abortion debate is not hard. Everyone knows that upon conception, what that thing is growing towards, it's not a liver, and she didn't quite put it this way, but she said it's not a Cadillac. Like we can know certain things about potential life and how biology works and what the purpose of growth is and what ultimately a thing will become at its beginning. The old oak tree and acorn argument from the ancient tradition. So, jurisprudence on the First Amendment can obscure a lot of these questions, but ultimately a recourse to maybe the Scottish Enlightenment and some common sense jurisprudence is what we need. And I think this is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's we should, first of all, this is kind of where you start to get a little bit more based, and the more based you get, the more kind of case law you have to, or precedent you have to peel back to get at things. But we should plug Munoz's book, I think, the Religious Liberty in the American Founding, which came out pretty recently and goes into some of this stuff in detail. I also was looking at the Publius schedule just today and noticing that these kids are going to get Munoz all day on Friday with his base interpretation of the Establishment Clause, and then they're going to get me on Sunday haranguing them about how if you take God out of the picture, you end up abandoning babies to die like the Spartans. So it's really going to be quite a time for the Publius fellows. But no, I mean, I think like what the really base thing to say is like, you know, the founders actually had a meaning in mind when they said the words, you know, God and religion. And, you know, it wasn't the God of any one particular sect or even arguably of any one Abrahamic faith, but nor was it the God that could demand, you know, the slaughter and sacrifice of infants en masse. And so then when you start saying, well, who really gets the protection of the Establishment Clause? Like, I actually don't think it's the Church of Satan personally. No. And I think that the founders would have known that. And this undermines another O'Connorism, which is the idea that like the founders could never have predicted the proliferation of all the different sects there would be in the country. And therefore, they can't possibly have meant to set aside atheism as like a distinct other thing. But that's just not true. I mean, that's something that like John Locke addresses and even Rousseau is kind of plain about this. So anyway, we're getting off on a tangent. Yeah. We do have one more thing to talk about.
We could do a couple Leo Strauss deep cuts, Spencer, which is he was asked at one point, you know, why he liked America, and he praised a country where, you know, it was where the word atheist was still a dirty word. That was a good thing for him. And a man, I should add, who was, to say the least, a secular Jew, really not a believer. I was self-professed, not a believer. But then he also said, you know, on the sort of the questions of the this reason and revelation may differ over, you know, the good life or the ultimate end of man, whether it's philosophy or faith or piety. But they can certainly agree, and they seem to agree across the ages on the general preconditions for a decent and moral civic order. That is the kind of moral virtues ground that one needs to build upon if you're going to have a successful, especially self-governing small r republic. So we've lost sight of all of this over the last century or so, and maybe our jurisprudence is starting to get a little saner.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, the unhopeful observation here is like how long we've been going down the wrong path in the courts. The hopeful observation to me is like, you know, that the level of religious belief that the country is sort of founded upon, taken for granted, at least in the public square, is, you know, really quite minimal by design, you know. And the question, like, do you believe in God, is still, even though it's at an all-time low, it's still like 81% of people say like, yes, we believe in God. So there is a kind of a consensus out there, and perhaps if we trend in a better direction in the courts, there's hope for us yet. In any case, we digressed on this because this stuff is really interesting, and I imagine our listeners will actually be happy.
One more Munoz plug. Sorry, Spencer. If people want a quick way to learn more, he just did a podcast, pretty good one, with the First Things podcast on this question of establishment of religion, if you want the crib notes version.
Excellent. And review of that book is coming out in CRB as well. Seth, did you want to say something? It sounds like you were about to break in.
No, I'm just taking it all in.
Sorry. It sounded like you were about to break in, but let's get to our last topic here, because it bears discussing, and I think it probably won't be the last time that we address this. The Uvalde police office is starting to come out with some really kind of harrowing and disconcerting testimony. A top that I'm reading here from KUT, from NPR, really. It's Austin's NPR station. A top Texas law enforcement official said that there were enough armed police officers wearing body armor to stop the late May shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, 3 minutes after it began, but instead it took an hour and 14 minutes from when officers arrived at the school to when they breached the door and ended the standoff with the gunman. I mean, I feel a certain degree of hesitancy going into this topic, as I always do when introducing, school shooting or shooting related topics, but especially now when, the police are so generally beleaguered in national politics, so hard done by. There's so much accusation lobbed against them that it simply isn't in good faith. And yet, the more we hear about this, the more damning it seems, in terms of this particular police department's response to this crisis. This is Steve McCraw, director of the Texas Department of Public Safety, called the response to the shooting an abject failure and said it was antithetical to the lessons learned about active shooter situations since the shooting at Columbine High School in 1999. Most affecting, perhaps, is this woman, Eva Mireles, who called her husband after she had been shot. She says she had been shot and she was dying. And this guy who then, this is also from McCraw, right? This husband, Ruben Ruiz, who's a police officer for the school district, was on the scene, got this call, and he tried to move forward into the hallway. McCraw said he was detained, and they took his gun away from him and escorted him off the scene. I've seen a lot of discussion of this, a lot of speculation about what might be going on, but I confess myself perplexed to a certain degree. I mean, I have a question for you guys, which is just, what the hell is going on here? I mean, this seems really egregious, no?
It's interesting. Yeah, I'm hesitant to opine in any grand fashion on this, Spencer, because I think, we'll continue to see more details come out, or to offer some grand theory about why it happened, but I'll do so anyway.
When is that ever stopped?
My suspicion is that this is another example of the increasing bureaucratization of many factors of civil society and local government that is the product of a certain way of looking at how to do public policy, public safety, and all the rest over the last century. It's like ho-hum on this podcast now to say it, but this is the wages of progressivism in many ways. The long experience of law enforcement in the West, especially with sheriffs, but also with local forces, is that while professional police forces are a fairly new thing, they grew up with cities. But for a long time, the tradition was a citizen with a certain skill set, either raised up by his peers through election or through some process, protecting other fellow citizens. So it has its roots in an very old American idea, which is self-reliance and mutual protection of rights. I suspect what is happening in our police forces is, just think of your local police department becoming more and more like the DMV. Now, that maybe was the case with the front office and the HR department for a long time, but one worries after examples like this that it's increasing, that it's bleeding over into actual actors on the ground. There was this anonymous write-up by a police officer who I think had resigned, or maybe it was someone speaking to police officers, basically a few, 4 months after the riots, the George Floyd riots in 2020. And the thesis of which was basically like, no, I'm not going to work 12-hour days anymore, witness horrible things because I'm dealing with violent crime all the time, spend half my time writing up with all these bureaucratic mandates in great detail what happened during that day, what happened during a certain instant, combining kind of community safety officer with amateur psychologist, with crisis counselor, and having mild PTSD because of dealing with violent crime. I'm not going to do any of that anymore because basically the narrative that's being sold to me is that, I'm a de facto, especially if my skin's a certain color, I'm a de facto racist, and I need to basically walk on eggshells all the time. It's just not worth it. I'm going to go find something else to do. So I suspect with our racialized politics combined with the bureaucratization and centralization of public safety and law enforcement, I think the profession probably selects less and less for the type who would have run in self-reliantly and put life at risk to end that quickly. And then I'm sure there are a bunch of procedures that help for even that remnant, like that officer, it sounds like, who was inclined to do that, perhaps partly to save his wife, who's also his fellow citizen and under his care as a police officer, of course. so it selects against those types, but then the few that still make it in, or the however many still make it in who are so inclined, they're frustrated by rules that prevent them from acting commonsensically, if a bit courageously when it really calls for it. That's my worry, and I think I'm probably right.
Yeah, I think you probably are. I mean, here's the thing: like, the pandemic showed a lot of Americans, or rather the response of the schools and the teachers union and teachers to the pandemic showed a lot of Americans that the teachers union is not about, it's like what Albert Shanker, the founder or one of the heads of the U of T in New York, said. He's like, well, when students pay dues, I'll worry about them. The fact is that the education mission is secondary to the teachers union. What they're really concerned about are their members and preserving, their benefits, whatever, advocating for teachers. Now, I don't know if the Uvalde police are unionized or not. I don't think it really matters, but this sense that municipal employees, what they're all about is like the job and their pensions, protection, whatever. So I don't know if it's the bureaucratization of it, or just the professionalization, in a sense, not professional in the sense of like accreditation, but just here's your job, this is your job, like the jobization of the job. Like, this is what you do, and keeping it together, keeping it's almost like the thin blue line, but in a negative sense. Look, I'm pro-cop. I write about this all the time. I'm not going to take a backseat to anyone on this question, but I think if you're going to be honest and be like pro-law and order and pro-police and pro-law enforcement, you have to accept that sometimes there are really bad cops and there are really bad departments, and sometimes they just really screw up badly, and maybe they need to rethink certain aspects of how this job is done. I mean, anyone who, in New York, we would have these, when in the office, they would bring people in to talk about, fire marshals type talks, but they would talk about, what do you do in an active shooter, event? And it used to be, the idea was that, well, you just go along, you just try to mollify the person, but that's not the way they do it anymore. The idea is, no, you have to attack them. So, we would have some guy from the police department telling a bunch of office workers that if someone's trying to shoot up the whole office, you need to attack them.
Right.
Okay, that's fine, but one expects the police to do that too.
Yeah. So,
yeah, I think we have to be willing to really, call them out. I wouldn't pussyfoot around this. Like, that's like an embarrassment. That's egregious, whatever happened there.
Yeah. I'm reminded, sorry. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm reminded as, yes, bad. I think we agree on this. No, I mean, I'm reminded as I hear Ryan and you, Seth, also talk about this, of weirdly, kind of tangentially, this story that came out of the Atlantic as the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan was unfolding, and it was somebody trying to get an interpreter out. I think he had been working with this interpreter, and that this guy had become kind of an integral part of the American effort over there, and he was trying to get this guy out before the airports were captured, basically. And buried somewhere in this article is just a list of all the things that he had to get done in order to try to make this happen. And one of them was he had to get a negative COVID test. and I just remember, I wrote about this for the site because I just remember looking at that and thinking, like, there's probably no human alive, like even your most egregious, COVID hawk, who would look at that and think that's a good rule. We want to make sure that none of the people fleeing Afghanistan that we're trying to get out, on America's credit, we want to make sure none of them is COVID positive. And maybe I'm being too generous to COVID hawks here, but a vanishingly small percentage of people would actually, if any human reviewed that rule, would say, like, yes, in this case we should stick to that rule. But that is kind of what these bureaucratic systems do, right? They take on a life of their own. They're sort of designed to do that so that you don't have to have a human consciousness making its own, decisions on a case by case basis, but you just have these kind of this sweeping machinery. And when I read about this guy being kept out, he was like, it was ready to go in there and confront this shooter on behalf of his wife, and she's dying in there, this heartbreaking story. And you think, well, what could they possibly have been doing keeping him out of there, except following some sort of mindless procedure that and already in these situations, as you're saying, Seth, right, it takes just almost superhuman courage, amazing courage to say, yeah, I'm going to run into that situation and put my body in between, this violent gunman and the weak. It takes an incredible act of self-sacrifice to do that. But people do it. People in these extreme situations do muster that courage. But to put another obstacle in the way of that, namely this just kind of mindless bureaucratic machinery, which seems to be at work, it's really heinous, and it's no surprise that kind of system is going to reward the worst people and chase the best people out of the job. They're going to take their skills elsewhere, and who could blame them? And if that's the reward they're going to get, if even in their moment of greatest valor they're going to run into red tape, like, yeah, I don't blame people for kind of wanting out.
Yeah, and also a combination of sort of risk aversion and path dependency. It brings to mind the quip that Angelo Codevilla liked to bring up, that the Flight 93 people who probably saved the White House and or the Congress from being hit by that plane broke federal law in assaulting the hijackers because since in the 70s there are all these hijackings and they were done for money, and they usually would turn out fine. You'd pay the money and they'd land the plane somewhere. And so they didn't want to risk mass casualty events from scuffles in the air. So the federal government banned any resistance against hijackers. And that was still in place, at 9/11, even though that practice had really fallen out decades earlier. So that it's a witch's brew, I think, of maybe I think Seth's a little right. Maybe I'm a little right. And, we have pieces of this, and we'll see what really comes out of Uvalde. I also remember that something similar happened with Parkland, right? It doesn't seem quite as bad, but there was some dithering, and maybe that was just an individual incompetent. I forget the circumstances, but that shooting was improperly addressed as well. And it looks like, to get to Seth's sort of union culture point about workforces and protecting themselves, it looks like from a lot of these Uvalde examples, and I think it was a little true in Parkland, although eventually it got sorted out, the first instinct of local police and law enforcement is to kind of cover all this stuff up and circle the wagons. So it takes a while to figure out what exactly went wrong and in how many ways.
Well, you guys, this has been a good one. Thank you for your contributions. As always, I think I'm going to close us out with that. It's a sobering topic to end on. But like I say, I doubt that we have heard the last of this, or that we are discussing it here for the last time. With that, I will thank all of our listeners for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, you can visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewofbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Since I always plug people's books at this stage, I'm going to briefly mention that my book is now up for pre-sale on Amazon. It's called How to Save the West. You can find it there. And you can also donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. We hit 1,000 reviews on Apple Podcasts, and most of those are 5-star reviews. I think we have an average of 4.8, which shows that our faithful listeners are following my advice to at least keep their criticisms to themselves. But seriously, we do appreciate that enormously. It really helps helps to the show when you give us a good rating. If you haven't already done that, please do. We would really appreciate it. And finally, since our steadfast producer, Jake Gannon, is not here, he's not going to be able to stop me from putting him on blast and saying that the reason he's out is because he's getting married. So a very hearty congratulations to Jake Gannon. Thanks to Noah Peterson, as always, for his work also on the show. And thanks to you all for listening. Talk to you next week.